My name is Ellen McGrattan, and I'm director of the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today for the Economics of Trade Wars, 25 Years of NAFTA. This should be a very interesting conversation on one of the most pressing policy issues of our day. Tonight, I'm happy to say the event is hosted with both the Carlson Global Institute and the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute. In our previous partnership, we had another NAFTA event where we had invited the architects of NAFTA, Carla Hill, who was the trade representative of the US, John Weeks, who was the trade representative of Canada, and Jaime Sarapuche, who was the trade representative of Mexico. That happened in 2017. So tonight we're going to have a follow-up. Tim Kehoe was the guy who was able to connect all those guys, and he's with us here again, so he'll update us on what's going on with the NAFTA events. I would like to thank Litigation Analytics for their generous sponsorship of the event. Without it, it's very hard to put on anything like this. Tonight we'll be hearing from three experts on trade, and we're going to be the main moderator is going to be Pete Kappelman, who is Senior Vice President and member and Government Relations at Land O'Lakes. Pete is a fourth-generation farmer who is now running Meadowbrook Dairy Farms. We'll be joined also by Stefanie Lenway, who is currently the Dean of the University of St. Thomas, the Opus College of Business. And Stefanie used to be here at the Carlson School on the faculty, so we welcome her back. And last but not least, my colleague Tim Kehoe, who again, like I said, was the one who put on the first show looking at NAFTA. Tim is a distinguished McKnight University professor in the Department of Economics. He serves as an advisor to the Federal Reserve and an advisor to the National Bureau of Economic Research. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to Pete Kappelman and to the other panelists.
Well, thank you, Ellen, and welcome everyone. I don't know that I can welcome everyone to an event here because this is the first time I've been here, so I appreciate being asked.
I'll welcome you.
Thank you. So 25 years of NAFTA, the economics and maybe we should say the policy of trade wars, because that's a big reason of why things happen or don't happen. If there was a little confusion with my bio, it's really hard to be a full-time dairy farmer and a senior vice president, so I'm not, right? My kids are home running the farm, and I had some free time because I gave them the authority to run it, so I was asked to serve in the role of senior vice president for member relations, which is our 1,800 dairy farmers and our 1,100 locally owned ag retailers, as well as government relations and our international development division. So it's a big role. It's in some ways very related to what I used to do, and in some ways it's a new learning. But I was actually, and I'm not sure why I got asked, frankly. I'm one class away from my bachelor's degree in ag econ. I had my dairy science degree, but I'm one class. And I've been part of a couple of these types of panels before, and I think it's really important to get it grounded. But I love the big picture of economics. I love understanding the mechanics behind it. And I used to hang out in the ag econ department down at Madison, and I love the work economists do. In fact, they've predicted 6 of the last 4 recessions that we've had, so I think they're...
Including the current one.
And I've been waiting for this current one to happen for a long time. I have no equities. I have no money left in equities anymore. But we are going to get into that, and NAFTA and USMCA is critically important for the field Land O'Lakes works in, agriculture. Canada and Mexico are number 1 in 3 destinations for exports, almost a third of our exports, agricultural exports, going into Canada and Mexico. And as far as small and medium business exports, number 1 and 2 destinations for those exports, $125 billion. So I'm going to turn it over to Stefanie and let her do a little bit of introductory remarks, and we'll get into questions. We're going to have a little discussion up here, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience.
Thanks,
Stefanie.
Pete. So good evening, everybody. I'm a dean. It means I'm not an expert. So just to be clear. But I did sort of go back and look at the origins of NAFTA. So once I taught a case on Mexican auto production and trade in international business, which I piloted here. And the case really made the point that it was possible to make cars in Mexico. The problem was it cost so much nobody would buy them. Okay, so the same was true in Canada because they couldn't get economies of scale and they had a relatively high labor cost. So in 1965, the US and Canada signed an Auto Pact. Now, Canada didn't want to give up production. See, I'm beginning to think countries and people like the benefits of trade, and they just don't like the adjustment costs. So Canada said, okay, we'll do a deal with you to lower barriers. But for every car that is imported to Canada, we have to sell a Canadian car. And by the way, 50% of the car has to have Canadian content. Believe it or not, that worked. And trade increased. And the US got angry because Canada had a surplus in auto trade to the US, even though this was pretty minor. Okay, so in 1988, they signed a free trade agreement between Canada and the United States, which continued to liberalize and bring down tariffs in autos. And trade continued to grow. What happened after 1988 is the Japanese and other Asian and European automakers started to produce in Canada or import to Canada. And the US didn't want those cars to come in, even though they were pretty good cars. So this was renegotiated and eventually led to NAFTA. I mean, all of these agreements are an attempt to reduce trade barriers, but not completely, which creates other problems and the need for future negotiations. Now, what is a free trade agreement? If you were my class, I'd call on you. But I only have one student here, so, and I don't want to embarrass her, because I know she knows the answer really well. So look, it goes back to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and Most Favored Nation status, which is a good, it's really, you say, this is the best tariff I'm going to give any country that signs the agreement, formerly GATT, now WTO. Okay. There are always exceptions. If you reduce tariffs basically to zero on over 50% of trade, you can do better than Most Favored Nation. And that's what NAFTA did. It reduced tariffs on trade between Canada and the US and Mexico and the US, basically to zero. Except for there were exceptions. Did I say exceptions? And that's part of the problem. Or the motivation for renegotiating NAFTA. Canadian dairy was left out. They have a pretty nice system, different from ours. US manufacturing moved to Mexico because labor costs were cheaper, thereby disadvantaging certain communities. And we kept local content on cars that could be traded tariff-free to, I think, 62.5%. The result was a deficit in Mexican trade, US trade with Mexico, because a lot of the final goods came in assembled in Mexico, sold in the United States. And then there was the dairy issue, and then there's the question of wages, where Mexican labor is paid less, it's less skilled. So a part of the new, you know, it starts with a different letter in each country. In our country, it starts with US. In Mexico, it starts with M, and in Canada, it starts with C. So call it what you want. The new agreement addresses each of those three issues. We can get into, I have a lot of notes, but I'm not going to go into them. What I think is happening is there's more disparities within countries like the US than between countries. And those regions that are left behind, low-skilled manufacturing, agriculture, are really feeling like the benefits of trade are, coming out of them, and we're not compensating them or educating them or helping them transition to growth sectors of the economy, which is sort of part of the social contract. So there's no question that the continued liberalization of trade contribute to economic growth that we enjoy in North America. No question. To me, the question is, what do we do with the people who are displaced? And that's something that needs attention, needs policy creativity, and we can talk about more as the evening progresses.
Okay,
So.
Thank you, Stefanie. Tim, do you have some opening remarks?
Yeah, thank you, Pete. I can see we have a lot of things to discuss here. But let me just mention a couple, step back a bit. Am I a globalist or a nationalist, right? That's a question that our president has proposed. Well, I'm a globalist, and let me tell you why. It's because globalization, by that I mean the spread of trade, technology, investment, and migration throughout the world that's occurred over the last 200 years has been the biggest economic success in world history. And I just wanted to mention a couple things related to that we often lose sight of. Right now there's lots of criticism of globalization from populists on both the left and the right, and I think there's something to that criticism. But let me just think about the big picture. Up until about 1800, there was no per capita growth in world history. That's a bit, the economic historians debate about that a bit, but to first order, that's true. That is, the world was not getting richer. In 200, the average working person in England had health, life expectancy, so forth, similar to people did 5,000 years ago. There were a few rich people, but in general, the world was as poor as it had ever been. There was a brief period in the 14th century in Europe when living standards went up. And the explanation for that's kind of sad. There's something called the Black Death hit Europe and killed about 1/3 or 40% of the people. And the people who were left had more resources and lived a little bit better for 50 or 60 years. In Britain, 200 years ago, we had something start called the Industrial Revolution start. What's fascinating about that is that it's not just something for economic history. Most of the world, the majority of population in the world live now in countries that did not experience the Industrial Revolution until after 1960. Okay, up until 1960, most of the world's population lived in countries that did not have the kind of growth that Britain did in the early 19th century. And since 1990, inequality, this is a fact that's often overlooked, economic inequality, looking at people as people around the world, has dropped for the first time since the English started getting richer than everybody else in around 1800. That's not to say there's not increased inequality in the United States. There is, or in Europe, or in India or China. But the fact is, countries like India, China, Mexico have fair portions of their population that are entering the world's middle class. 1/3 of the population of India is now middle class by world standards. Same for China. Each 1/3 of each of their populations is the size of the United States or Western Europe. Okay, now let's think about trade specifically. At the very end of the Second World War, the Allies, who saw themselves being victorious, they've begun to call themselves the United Nations, got their economic bigwigs together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to try to think, what can we do to ensure peace after the war? What can we do to avoid things like the 1930s that led to the Second World War and massive death and destruction throughout the world? And they came up with 3 Bretton Woods institutions. The World Bank to give loans to developing countries, the International Monetary Fund to regulate exchange rates, and the famous International Trade Organization to regulate world trade. And you're going to say, well, Tim, what are you talking about? I've never heard of the ITO. No, you haven't. That's right. It was stillborn, although, and this is something that Stefanie was just referring to, a preliminary piece of setting up the ITO was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and that ended up being the way that we tried to keep countries from engaging in the trade wars that were so common, and the United States was one of the worst offenders in this with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, in exacerbating and prolonging the Great Depression in the 1930s with trade wars. Well, the GATT finally gave way to the ITO, but they changed the name to WTO in 1995. But that's kind of ironic, because that was just when the GATT was running out of gas. All U.S. presidents in between Herbert Hoover and our current president were free trade promoters, and we'd worked through the GATT to promote free trade, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then there was a breakdown because of disagreements on agriculture and asymmetric treatment of rich and poor countries. We moved towards regional or free trade agreements, preferential trade agreements. And the NAFTA, and I'd say now the USMCA, but we'll get to that. USMCA does not exist except as the Mexican legislature has approved it. Nobody else has. And my own guess is no one else ever will. And we can get back to that in a minute. And I think what's going to happen is NAFTA will just stay in force because there's nothing else to do, at least until the next presidential election. But you know, we had this global recession. People often call it the Great Recession. There's nothing great about it. But we had this recession that started in the United States maybe the end of 2007. I think that was a political choice in dating it, but really in 2008. And then in parts of the world, it was still going on until fairly recently. The recovery from that has been the most feeble recovery. I know unemployment's down in the United States and so forth, and wages have even gone up a bit. But it's not like the kind of recovery we had from recessions back in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. And it hasn't been a vigorous recovery throughout the world. World growth is kind of stagnated. Trade is stagnated and declined. And we gotta think about what to do about that. There is this populist reaction on both the left and the right against trade. If there's a problem in your country, the villain has to be a foreigner. And in the United States, of course, when we think foreigners who are at fault, we think Chinese and Mexicans. But believe me, when you go to Europe, they have the populists there, they have a different list of villains. You go to Asia, they have a different list of villains. And so we're going to have to talk about that.
It's going to be a great conversation. So, and I have so many notes here from things that you said. Let's just back up. So, NAFTA. Who won? Who benefited from NAFTA?
Everybody.
First, everybody, okay. But not every part of every country.
Right.
That's right.
Otto, there are lots of stories about manufacturing shutting down in the US and opening up in Mexico. The zero tariffs made it attractive to do a lot of manufacturing and assembly there and then just move across the border.
Right.
In my wanderings around the Midwest, I lived outside of Detroit, and you really do feel that the Windsor, Canada, Detroit region is one unified economic bloc. And Pontiac, where they used to make Pontiacs, and Cadillac, where they used to make Cadillacs, they're sort of backwaters in Michigan. The real energy is between Detroit and Windsor.
Right.
And that started in the Auto Pact.
No, and you know, the automobile industry, when you look at manufacturing industries, has been shrinking in importance, but what's interesting about it, it's been growing in importance in international trade. And Stefanie's referring to this phenomenon where, you know, in the 1980s, if you looked at the Canadian automobile industry, the US automobile industry, the Mexican automobile industry, actually they were dominated by what we call the big three, but there was not production sharing. You could buy a Ford in Mexico, but it had no U.S. parts in it. And for all three of the countries, we now have a North American automobile industry. And one thing that did is it made US, Canadian, Mexican cars more competitive with German and Japanese cars. Why do we keep saying cars? Cars and car parts are, depending on the year and value, 20-25%. That's by far the biggest good we trade. Agricultural products, Pete, are very important. Minnesota exports lots of dairy, but especially soy and corn and so forth. But it's not big compared to cars and car parts.
Okay.
And NAFTA really saved the North American the automobile industry.
So we really, in essence, don't have borders as far as autos with NAFTA.
That's right.
We're operating as one economy, more or less?
Yeah.
That's right.
And it saves a lot of money. Cars really haven't they haven't suffered from inflation like other products.
That's right.
What's interesting is you look at the cost for electric cars, and it's quite different. They need fewer workers to assemble and fewer parts. So, while we'd like to blame the outsider, innovation drives much more economic dislocation than trade.
Yep.
And you're seeing it. You see that in cars.
Right. No, and these things increase average incomes, average welfares, but it doesn't necessarily help everybody. So let's think about.
Yeah, let's go back to, was it Ross Perot
Yeah.
that coined the giant sucking sound that NAFTA would create? Let's talk about some of that.
Right.
Well, it's created problems, social problems, infant mortality. The opioid crisis really has sort of seeped into those regions of the country that have become peripheralized. And that's a huge social and political problem. And if we don't address it, political coalitions will hold trade hostage because it's not correct, but it sounds good. They're hurting us. I mean, everybody thinks a trade deficit means we are somehow weak. Tim, you can help me with this, but all trade deficits are financed by the inflow of money to prop up the currency. And if money doesn't come in, trust me, the deficit will go down really quickly, so we won't be able to afford any imports.
That's right. That's right.
That was in my class too, by the way.
No, that's
So
right.
did NAFTA need to get renegotiated? Should it have been renegotiated?
There are pieces of the NAFTA. Now, this is something that Carla Hills and Jaime Serra and John Weeks talked about in this same room two years ago. And they're the ones who drew up the NAFTA. And they were saying, sure, 25 years have gone by, and what we need to do is update it. We need rules on internet trade, electronic, that didn't exist in 1994, and the current USMCA agreement has provisions on that. So what? And Stefanie already
And actually, it helps fix a little bit the dairy disparity.
3.6% of Canadian dairy goes to the
but it's
US.
more than that, because Canada was actually short of butterfat, right? When the butterfat is not bad for you anymore, it's good for you, right? So it's like, hey, great, I'm eating more butter, right? And by the way, we have this quota system, and we can't make enough butter, so we were importing it. Canada was importing it from New York and Wisconsin, and the dairy farmers in Canada said, wait a minute, we could just make more, right? And so they gave more quota to their producers. They shut off the border on that ultra-filtered milk, which then created a problem with some producers on the northern border. But the problem is, when you make butter, you get what's left is the skim milk, and they didn't have a use for that. So they were blowing it out under world prices. They were selling it in Mexico under world prices, lowering effectively global prices for skim milk, which was hurting us.
And lowering nutrition
Exactly.
in some cases without being completely transparent.
So I mean, I think there are updates that are valuable.
That's right.
So now you can buy a Kindle from a book, ebook from Canada, and it's tariff-free.
Right.
It's good. I mean, that's good. What, Tim? What do you
But
think?
90%, Pete, of the USMCA or TAMEC or the CUSMA, as it's called in Canada, is the NAFTA, with large pieces taken from the TPP. And see, because that already had liberalization of Canadian dairy in it. And that was the update. Then there were some other pieces, and especially related to the automobile industry, that 40 to 45%, and exactly how they're going to administer this, of car parts have to be produced by workers earning more than $16 an hour. And that was chosen to make sure it meant Canadian and U.S.
So
workers.
what is that gonna do?
It's not clear. It's not clear what it's going. Well, since the USMCA is not going to get passed, at least until after the presidential election, it's nothing that we.
Now I've been hearing differently.
Oh, you have.
Yeah,
oh, and you just came from Washington, so tell us.
Yeah. So.
Awesome.
Not only have I just come from Washington, but I just talked to my local congressman from Wisconsin yesterday on the phone, and it's an interesting process because I think, I mean, you both agree that USMCA is an improvement over NAFTA, or at least
some pieces are and some pieces aren't,
Okay.
but we could.
It's not that different.
okay.
So,
Labor provisions. I mean, the
No,
Democrats
well,
are saying we need.
Let me
Well-
tell you a big problem is the President Trump had wanted a national content rule in the free trade agreement, especially for automobiles, that every automobile had to have a certain content produced in the United States, and then that means it's not a free trade agreement
Right.
at all. That's not there, but there is this 75% of value as opposed to the 62.5 that Stefanie was talking about under NAFTA. That number was chosen so as not to be binding on the big three or what's left of the big three, because Chrysler is now, of course, Fiat Jeep, and it's not even owned in the United States anymore. But what it means is there's Honda producers in Canada, there's Volkswagen, BMW producers in Mexico, and there's Toyota producers in the United States. This will bind on all of them. And so that means that the foreign car producers who operate in all three countries are going to have a lot of trouble adjusting to that.
But see, I think they're all going to go to electric cars.
Well, this was something that came as a surprise when we started pushing some of the trade wars, the way that GM all of a sudden laid off 50,000 workers in different plants through North America. But it's clear why that's happening, and I think Stefanie's right on this. We're not sure where personal cars are going in terms of that manufacture. I mean, it's one of the, as far as international trade goes, it's the biggest industry in the world. But are we going to keep producing gasoline-powered cars? Are we going to have self-driving cars? Are we going to have shared cars? I mean, and that will affect the whole thing. If you're in a situation where all of a sudden it becomes costly to do the old way, then you switch sooner out of that. And so this could have a pretty drastic effect on the U.S. Car industry. Just as the way that people like Target source from countries in Southeast Asia, and especially China, if they're thinking, oh, well, are we going to lose out to Amazon? How are things going? This could speed up that process. I'm not sure that's bad, but I'm not sure it's good either.
It could be the best thing for global warming.
Yeah.
Well,
So the quick answer to will it get voted on is the Republican answer was 2/3 of a chance, 66% chance it gets voted on before the year end.
okay.
And Democrats are even higher.
So
Especially, so I think Nancy Pelosi is in a special position because she wants to retain control of the House. And in order to do that, the new Democrats, the Angie Craigs and the moderate districts need a victory. And this could be the victory. Angie's supporting it. There's a lot of the new Democrats.
Dean Phillips.
Yeah, a lot of the new Democrats are coming out supporting it. So we'll find out. We'll find out. So let's take this local. What would USMCA mean? Anything different for Minnesota companies or industries?
The big exporters in Minnesota are high tech. Things like medical equipment, factory control equipment, and so forth. I mean, come on, 3M, Honeywell, companies
Donaldson.
yeah. They're not going to be, for them, there hasn't been a big change in the rules. The other big exporters here are agriculture. And we were listing them: soybeans, corn, the pork products, the dairy.
And frankly, that's more of a China question than it is.
That's
I mean, China's huge.
and Mexico. Mexico does buy lots of corn and soy from the United States,
But
and Minnesota.
that part of the formula shouldn't change unless NAFTA gets nullified,
Right.
which was discussed for a period of time.
That
That's
would
right.
be a big mess.
That would be a mess.
Yeah.
That
No,
would be
I haven't
a
heard
mess.
that brought up lately.
No.
It's a bad idea.
I had been, so it's good you are more current than I am, but a couple weeks ago I'd been at a big conference in Dallas on this, and I spoke with Ildefenso Guajardo, who was the Mexican trade minister who negotiated the USMCA, and his sources had been less optimistic. But he said right now nobody wants to kill. It's not good for anybody with the uncertainty in the economy to kill North American trade. So that he didn't think the USMCA would be passed, but it might be, huh? I'm listening to what you're saying. But they're not going to scrap NAFTA either right now.
Well, that would be the best news, I think. So we talked about this a little bit, but the understanding of how globalism or free trade, protectionism, and nationalism are now all playing against each other.
Right.
And not just with Trump in the U.S., but Brexit in Europe. I mean, nationalism was alive and well in many parts of the world.
That's right.
What's contributing to this rise?
Well, and this is something that you've referred to and Stefanie was stressing, and I wasn't, because I was looking at the head of world picture. The fact is that in the overall economic advances we're making, some people are being left behind. And trade and foreign investment are easy things to blame for that. The fact is, when we look at job loss in manufacturing in the United States, some of that has been because of trade with countries like Mexico and China. That's for sure. Most of it's due to automation and increases in productivity, and we need fewer and fewer people to produce more and more goods. When was the biggest year in terms of real output for the US manufacturing sector? Was last year. When will we beat that? This year. You know, we're producing more and more goods. It's just we need less and less workers to do that. Now that's good for us as consumers, but it's not good for the workers who are losing their jobs.
Unless you got paid the same and could go home early, right?
But I heard somewhere we'd be short over 1 million manufacturing workers because we're having a sort of a national labor shortage.
Yeah, we need free trade in workers.
Don't
call it immigration, though.
Okay, free trade in workers. One point I didn't make is when NAFTA was first thought of, it really was a response to the creation of the European Union, where they have a currency union, free movement of people, services, and goods. NAFTA was not that. It was the free movement of goods and not people and some services.
Right.
And that's important, and I think, you know, Brexit brought a lot of people from all over Europe to the UK, and improved medicine, improved a lot of things, but some people took issue with dilution of British culture. I don't know.
You're right. I was just last week in Santiago, Chile, and I started going to Chile about 20 years ago. And I don't know if people have been following the news. When just the weekend I was there was they shut down the city, and I was locked in my hotel 12 hours a day because no one could go in the streets because, and Chile is the country that has gained the most in Latin America for globalization. But there's a sizable fraction of the people who feel left behind. And the way social media works and the way news works, they're very aware of it. They can coordinate with each other, and they can take to the streets and engage, in this case, in violence and destruction. It's still going on. The violence has stopped. But the first weekend I was there, it was very ugly. People were killed. 1/3 of the rest of the supermarkets in Santiago were destroyed. A huge part of the metro system was destroyed, especially the part that would bring lower income people into the city to work. They're going to be a year or two recovering from some of this. And it was a reaction to saying, well, look, of course, average income's up and so forth, but we feel left behind, and let's do something about that.
So the rise in nationalism or populism is not just a political ploy to be the savior for those who are being disadvantaged or left behind, but it's actually there's an economic argument for protectionism.
No.
By keeping people employed?
No.
Because I've read a little on that. No.
No. Sorry.
And I'm going to agree with what Stefanie is saying, but let's remember when the Industrial Revolution hit Britain around 1800, there was a movement of people who went around and destroyed machines because they said machines are taking our taking our jobs. And they were, but it's not clear that protectionism stops that.
Yeah.
But is that some of the impetus behind
Yes.
actions, some of the political actions that are being taken for that reason?
When you protect an industry, you stop it from learning, you stop it from growing, and there's something called a deadweight loss. It's just a loss to society. when you trade, there are benefits, and the social contract suggests that these benefits should be distributed equitably. And we've forgotten that social contract. We don't do that. And that's the problem. We have to figure that out.
No, that's right. What we teach people, Pete, is that, trade makes everybody better off if you can redistribute to the losers. And we don't do that. Now, that's something Carla Hills talked a lot about 2 years ago, because they did set this mechanism up called trade adjustment assistance. But that's meant to identify the people who lose from trade. And it just doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't work because just imagine that if you're in a city that has air pollution, and some of the air pollution is caused by some factory, and then you say, the factory needs to compensate the people who suffer lung cancer because of the factory. You can say, of the 5,000 people in the city who have lung cancer or whatever caused by this pollution, that number is going to go up to 520. You're never going to identify those 20 people. So Carla was saying what we need is a program for people who are losing their jobs because factories or whatever are closing. Mm-hmm. We help all of them. And we do need something like that. We do need to retrain those people. We do need to find ways of either making it easier for people to move or bringing jobs to the parts of the countries that are being devastated by automation and trade. We got to do something.
Yeah.
So has that solution been talked about? I mean, you can close, I mean, I don't know when it was, the textile factories were closing down in the southeast, right? But what do you do if you're 40, 50, 55, 60 years old, and now your trade was taken away?
And you're in that in-between stage where you really can't retrain to do something else. It's a tragedy.
No, move to San Francisco and get a job with Google, right, at that point.
Yeah.
No, but that's the perfect question, because when you look at an American who loses their job for one reason or another, who's 20, 30 years old, they're going to get a new job. In fact, they're going to go through a couple more jobs, at least in their lifetimes.
4 or 5.
Yes. Yeah. But somebody who's 55, who's been working, in a factory and moved their way up the chain and so forth, getting a decent wage, and that factory shuts, that person's in trouble.
That's a blow, and we have a responsibility as citizens to figure out.
Now, let me mention one thing about trade, though, because there is a big part of trade that's poorly measured, which is trade in services. And the United States is the biggest service exporter in the world. In fact, my friend Ellen McGrattan, who introduced us, she has a number of papers suggesting that the U.S. trade deficit is not very big at all, might not even be there because we export so many services. It's just really tough to measure. When GM United States sells design services or copyrighted patent services to GM in Mexico, GM in Mexico probably doesn't pay the value that they're receiving for that, so it's badly measured to start with. And if they do, but what they do pay doesn't go to GM in the United States. It goes to GM in the Bahamas. This is not a joke.
That's transfer price.
This is not a joke. The GM in Detroit sells GM in the Bahamas all of its patent rights. And then the ones that hit, they get paid from people all over the world, and it sits in the Bahamas. And you know why the Bahamas? And it's actually, the schemes are usually much more complicated than this. It's because they don't pay taxes on it. It's like your IRA. You let the money accumulate, and at some point you can bring it back to the United States, but first let it accumulate there. And so talking about the trade deficit is all of a sudden becomes complicated when you try to bring stuff like that into account.
So Tim, I think it was you that mentioned the growing middle class, especially in Southeast Asia and
China,
India.
India.
China, yeah. Talk about how slowdown in globalization impacts. I mean, this growing middle class is a win-win for everybody, right? So, any thoughts on that?
No, and U.S. companies are in China because they're thinking, hey, as that Chinese customer base grows, there are new customers. There is a complication there, and I think economists, this is something where economists actually agree with something that the Trump administration is pushing. If you're going to do business in China, the Chinese used to have a regulation that said you needed a Chinese partner and you needed to share your technology and trade secrets with that partner. Then someone pointed out to
and I think they had to be 51% owners as well.
3M got
But what happened is somebody pointed out to the Chinese government after they joined the WTO, that's prohibited under the WTO. So they got rid of that. They took that off the books. They still do it. And that is something that the Trump administration, quite rightly, is objecting to. But you know, the way that I would have preferred going about that was the TPP, which was something that was set up to limit the Chinese influence in the Pacific, or go through the WTO. And instead we're doing this trade war, and I'm not sure that's the right way to do it.
Agreed.
It's dangerous.
Yeah.
They're harder to win than it looks like.
Oh, yeah, trade wars are not easy to win.
So,
as we see.
Yeah. So we're here in a university. How are you talking about trade and, I mean, what are you telling your students about the world we're living in now, or did we cover all those topics already?
I'm now teaching a graduate course in international trade to second-year PhD students. And I tell them that as citizens of the world, we have to be concerned about the potentially bad effects of trade wars and so forth. And there's a silver lining to that dark cloud, because we haven't had a serious trade war since the 1930s, and we didn't have good data back in those days. Really? Now, just with what we've had so far with China, or the steel and aluminum tariffs, we're generating all kinds of data. Imagine the research papers and theses that we could write on that.
Yeah. Let me tell you my perspective as a dean. You know, education is a service. When students come from abroad here, we're exporting a service, and with the difficulty in visa, you know, people who get visas, you've seen a reduction, especially for MBAs, of foreign students. They go to Australia, they go to England, they go to INSEAD, and they don't come here, and it's really cut into the financial models of business schools.
Yeah.
And it's very real. And adjusting takes time, and the hit is, you know, sudden.
Right.
Well, let's turn to some audience questions, and I'm just going to read them verbatim here, and we'll see what your answers are. The term NAFTA has been somewhat politically charged. Might USMCA be less so?
Yes.
Because
Because U.S. comes first.
No, but this is
not a check the box. This is a blue book exam. If you
this
remember what
is
those
something that when the architects of NAFTA, as Ellen referred to them, came here 2 years ago. They said the big political mistake that was made in all three countries is no one was actively promoting NAFTA. No one was actively defending NAFTA. Instead, it became a target for complaints about whatever was wrong in the economy had to be NAFTA's fault.
If your team lost the World Series, it was NAFTA.
Exactly. And so I think that experience makes us realize a relabeling. USMCA doesn't flow off my tongue like NAFTA does, but relabeling's probably not a bad thing.
So do you guys remember the song YMCA?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's how I
Make it-
remember it. Yeah, it's the
Yeah,
Village
yeah.
People
You have a
song.
dance.
Okay, here's a good one. Some of the conversation suggests industry exists to provide jobs rather than to create value. If you follow that logic, industries to secure jobs, isn't that a short step from a state-run economy?
So this is my chance to talk about St. Thomas. I mean, industry exists to contribute for a purpose to economic development. If you have a purpose, you create value, you will employ people, hopefully for the good of society. You need a business model, you need a strategy, you need value creation, and then you can hire people. You don't hire people, because then what? It's just not a sustainable activity unless they create more value than you pay them.
Although
Agree, Tim,
whoever came up with that question is hitting on something important. You know, there's a book I used to have my students read, not by an economist, but by a management consultant named Bill Lewis, called The Power of Productivity. And he had a theory that the reason why the United States was overall the richest, most productive country in the world, of course, the automobile industry was more productive in Japan. I mean, you could go through a list, but overall the United States was the most productive, is because Americans thought as consumers first, rather than as compared to other countries, rather than as workers or owners, because all of us are both. And if we want the best products, then we're driven to the lowest cost producers but you also need income to buy those products. So there's two sides to it, but as long as you think consumer first, then you have more efficiency.
Well, price equals marginal cost.
So the Business Roundtable just came out with a restatement of their purpose of a corporation, purpose of a business. Corporation, I think was the word. And we at Land O'Lakes had just joined the Business Roundtable because our CEO said, look, we need to talk to people other than agriculture, right? We need to talk outside agriculture. And so we joined, and they came out, they sent it to me, and I had to read through it before I sent it. And I'm like, this is why a co-op exists. I mean, we exist to help our members, but we do it through economic activity. You have to make widgets and have a marketing plan and sell them, and then you can afford to pay people the right wages, attractive wages, give them the kind of lifestyle they need. So here's another one. How can international trade help solve climate change problems?
Carbon trade.
Yeah.
That's unfortunately not happening.
And climate change and degradation of the environment are serious matters, and we got to do something about them. But this is something I was just in, as well as being in Chile last week, I was in Brazil, and the current government of Brazil is not wanting to take any advice or help from the rest of the world, because they say, well, this is, and the Amazon rainforest is the last big rainforest in the world, and that soaks up a lot of the world's CO2, and they don't want to listen to advice, especially from President Macron. And I'm not sure if you've followed this, but there was a big dispute because the Europeans wanted to help the Brazilians out with the fires that they're having now in the rainforest, and they don't want the help, and they don't want the Europeans telling them what to do. It could be a lever, Pete, to induce cooperation among countries on reducing emissions and so forth. But then you have to have people buying into it. And people in countries like Brazil, the more aware people will say, well, look, to countries like in Western Europe and in Western Europe or the United States, you people got rich degrading your environment. Why should you be telling us not to do the same with ours?
Yeah,
so that's a serious question. I don't know the answer.
Because as you create wealth, people accumulate more, and more vehicles, more goods that require more manufacturing. Now we're also learning about how to sustainably produce things,
Right.
and I think there's a real opportunity there to benefit. So,
Right, but if you take somebody from one of these countries that's kind of moving towards the world middle class, and you ask them, even as a popular matter, are you willing to put up with a little bit more pollution if you can now have a small car, or you can do this with that? They're going to say yes.
better life.
But look
Absolutely.
what happened in China. The pollution got so bad.
No, that's right.
The quality of life went down. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers on the sales of electric cars in China, but they're way more than the U.S.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
And, they experienced the downside of pollution, and Gerson Kahn, didn't he write about leapfrogs? And,
Yeah.
going to another paradigm, production paradigm.
Yeah.
And I think you'll see that.
But something does have to be done on that. But we have so little global agreement going on now, and what we have seems to be breaking down. It's not clear that we're going to get sensible agreement on pollution emission reductions.
we can agree on we can't agree on anything anymore, much less climate. I'm not sure that's getting, right now it's back burner.
But if you look, I think this is right. There was acid rain on the Canadian border, and there was a policy intervention that actually eliminated it, and it was part of the agreement between US and Canada. So there are precedents for addressing.
Well, and even though the United States government has backed away from the climate accord under this administration, global companies are asking for it. Yeah, they're in,
Yeah.
right? It's a requirement. You have to prove what you're doing and
If
show
you
what
want a
you're doing.
consumer.
So, do we think it's more beneficial to have global trade deals, multilaterals, or regionals, bilaterals, regionals and bilaterals?
I think what I was saying was the ideal is multilateral. It's just that when the multilateral stalled,
It's second best.
it's second best. The big problem, why did with the Doha round and so forth of the WTO, why did things start going wrong? It was lack of agreement on agriculture was one of the big things, because some of the less developed countries, and especially Brazil, are huge agricultural producers, and they wanted markets, and they're fairly close to manufactured goods too. But they were promoting this idea, let's have poor countries get markets for their agricultural products in rich countries, and then we'll buy more of your manufactured goods. And that wouldn't go. The Europeans and the Japanese are notoriously closed to agricultural trade. United States, not as much, because we're good at agriculture, and they're not.
And countries inherently, we talked a little bit earlier about sensitive industries, right? Well, in a trade deal, there's always something sensitive you're protecting. They tend to protect dairy because they want to make sure their kids aren't short of dairy. They tend to protect staples.
Right.
And it tends to be, it's actually the white commodities. So it's sugar, rice, milk. Those are the ones that are tough to make progress in. Now, when I was going over to Geneva for the WTO a few times there, I was always wondering, why are they bringing this Wisconsin dairy farmer to Geneva, right? I mean, again, I am not an economist, right? What am I doing in Geneva? But finally someone sat me down and said, look, for the 158 countries or whatever that were participating there, agriculture is the only thing that means anything to 130 of them, or 125 of them. Agriculture is it, right? And they want their fair stake in agriculture. And by the way, the U.S. opinion matters. That's why you're here. And Stefanie, it looks like you want to say something.
No, it's cool.
No, I thought, and then someone else said, well, you're just arm candy. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. I don't understand that. Back up a little bit. They're like, look, you're representing the U.S. dairy industry. And when their negotiators say, look, we're serious, we brought the U.S. dairy industry with us. And they're here to, and in that trade discussion where agriculture means everything to 130, the opinion of U.S. dairy meant something. So it was, to your point, it was, I would love to see more there, but right now we're struggling to get a bi or trilateral done.
Yep. But so, and let me just mention something with regard to the European Union, because I was in Sweden very shortly after they joined the European Union, and everybody was complaining about the increase in agricultural prices, in food prices. And you know why that was? Because the European Union has free trade within the European Union in agricultural goods, and so you'd import all kinds of goods produced by French farmers, for example. But then they impose really sharp barriers against the countries that Sweden used to buy the agricultural products from. And so that really raised all the prices of the agricultural goods.
Then the common agricultural policy.
That's right. That's right. Well, I taught for 4 years in Cambridge, England before I came here, and that was always a standard question on the exam, is discuss the impact of the common agricultural policy on the welfare of British consumers. And that's still an element in Brexit. So I don't know quite how to do it, but multinational trade liberalization is stalled. I mean, we can still promote it around the edges, but that's not where the action is. And it's not good that this is the case. Mm-hmm. Maybe if we had some more leadership, we could do something, but
tariffs aren't that high. I mean, they've come down a lot.
Right.
In most goods?
Yeah. So we have these difficult sectors, and then we have services.
That's right. Services and agriculture are the kind of unexplored territories there.
So
unexplored, they're explored, but we're just not getting anywhere with them.
I did actually do field research in Canada to study some of the issues in NAFTA, and culture is protected in Canada. And I just remember this one story. Somebody was talking about Dallas, that famous Canadian TV show. I mean, they didn't even know the origin of some of the artifacts, the cultural artifacts they were enjoying. It was, there were some light moments in my research.
So I think we've got time for a couple more questions, and then we'll have some summary comments. But is there any structural reason why liberalization tends to cause deficits in more affluent areas, surpluses in less affluent areas?
Money comes in.
I'll take as a factual matter, that's not true. So what's the country in the world with by far the biggest, it's not China, but by far biggest surplus, by far, is Germany, which is the richest country in Europe. So just as a matter of fact, that's not quite true, but I understand what it's saying about the United States. And there the answer, and Stefanie's already referred to this, is in the rest of the world, when people want to save, they want to buy US assets. And so all the money that flows into the United States to buy our stocks and bonds and so forth keeps the value of US currency high, and it makes it has to be balanced by the United States having a big deficit. Having a big trade deficit because we have a big capital accounts surplus.
And
It turns out that Germany does it the opposite way, though.
But
Because
that's an artifact of the big inflation after the First World War.
yeah,
Price stability is everything in Germany. Remember the Treaty of Versailles, which was part of the end of the First World War, created tremendous reparations from Germany to France and England, I think, sort of in some ways bankrupting Germany and creating that populist movement, which led to anti-Semitism, which led ultimately to the U.S. getting into, well, I guess the U.S. got in because of Pearl Harbor, but eventually it became a global war. And I mean, I grew up with that, and so they'd rather have price stability than competitive prices. But now that they're part of the European Union, they don't quite have the same control they did when it was a Deutschmark.
No.
It's psychological. It's, hopefully they'll be more flexible. That would allow for more growth, which I think will be important.
So as long as we're on the topic of psychology, what can economists do to shift people's attention from trade to the lack of work opportunities produced by the increase in work efficiency?
Look, there's adjustment costs. I mean, this brings back memory of my dissertation where I talked to, the auto unions, and they'd say, this auto worker is not going to become a brain surgeon. But the point was well taken because workers need more education if they're going to transition into higher value-added industries. And here we are in a great educational institution. We should be doing something. I was so I still come back to the U. I went to a reception last week for Mrs. Freeman. There in the Humphrey School, there's a new lounge, which is really nice. And the Freeman family is sponsoring a fellowship in rural economic development, which seems so spot on.
right. No, we need to be creative. I mean,
Yeah.
it's easy for us to sit up here and say, it's not really trade that's costing all these workers their jobs. Maybe 10% of the job loss. I have a recent paper that said at its peak, 15% of the job loss in manufacturing came from foreign competition. The other comes from technology. But then if you just say that and leave it at that as a policy maker, which I'm not, then you haven't made it anywhere. You have to be like Carla Hills was trying to do 2 years ago, is lay out a kind of retraining for younger workers, some kind of compensation for older workers, some kind of regional development policies. We got to come up with that, and that's a pressing need.
So my thought has always been education. Like, if we can educate our population to always rise above, right, to advance to the next level. For instance, in the hometown I grew up in, Miro manufacturing, aluminum cookware, aluminum fishing boats, right? They employed half the town. They employed 6,000 people. And eventually, when, I think it's bauxite, the aluminum raw product, when Mexico could stamp out aluminum pans at a lower cost than Manitowoc, Wisconsin could, guess what? That's where they punched them out. Now, shame on us, shame on the leadership. Why didn't we develop smart cookware or something, something that didn't burn, or something that, was
Didn't stick.
the next step, right? Don't just keep doing what you were doing, but create the next step up. And it's my belief that if we continue to educate our population on how to get to that next step, we can win in this. As a nation, we can win.
Well, that's right. I mean, here's and you must see this too, Pete, when you travel around. Half or more of the cities you go to have a thriving Uber industry. Imagine if instead of having the kind of the very easy technological advances that were used by Uber, if instead that had been developed within the taxi industry, then we could have had the whole thing aimed in a little bit direction. And a different direction, and I think that's what you're saying. We need to have, and maybe this is what a business school has to do, is promote people looking ahead for the next step. Because otherwise you do get left behind.
And now with digital platforms, it's going to transform everything. So unless you're into artificial intelligence and incorporating that into business models, it's going to be hard to be competitive.
So we're reaching that hour. We've got a few minutes for each of you to wrap up. Any closing thoughts, comments, messages you'd like to send, things that didn't get mentioned? Tim, let's start with you.
Well, there was, it's a very popular saying, it's usually ascribed to old Chinese saying, which it's not. It seemed to have been a saying developed within the Chamberlain family, and this is the father and brother of Neville Chamberlain, who is the British Prime Minister. May you live in interesting times, and they sometimes call that the Chinese curse. It's not Chinese at all. It's the Chamberlains somehow made that up. But we live in interesting times. Let's put it this way, we live in challenging times. And it's kind of, and Pete, this is coming back to what we were just talking about. We have to think, me as an economics professor, I have to think about how I can do research on thinking about what opportunities are and get my grad students doing it. You as a businessman have to think about what opportunities to look for, and so. But we all have to be doing it, and we have to vote for candidates who also look like they're going to be innovative. Although change is not always good with politics or anything. But I mean, you see what I'm saying? It's a tough time, but that should give us incentives to be a bit more imaginative and think ahead.
Creativity. Stefanie.
We need to develop policies for the people who've been displaced in order to make our lives more munificent and comfortable.
Right, no, that's right.
We really do. At some point, if we don't, you know, you can see it. Coalitions are going to form that are going to blame all their problems on trade, however displaced, because, you know, something bad happens and it looks like that could have caused it.
That's right. And it's happening all over the world. It's not just here.
And, you know, I told a story about the Auto Agreement, the Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Every phase, there were carve-outs. And the carve-outs created, you know, buffers to adjustment, which made the adjustment that much harder when it actually happened. We just kicked the can, and I think the world is shrinking. There are population displacements. We can't do that anymore. We're better than that.
It does seem like trade is getting blamed for advances, right?
Yeah.
So I think there is a prime opportunity to look beyond trade for
And help
the
people.
reasons.
It's not their fault that they ended up in a region with less resources, less education. You know, we're a rich
Exactly.
country.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you both for
Well.
joining us. And thanks to the Litigation Analytics for sponsoring, and to the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute, and of course the Carlson Global Institute.